Do 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 do. Extras.
This episode features a couple of scenes which didn't exactly happen, in the interest of tying up loose ends and making more of a narrative out of some things which happened off camera, and spinning together some highly disordered discussions about what the guys were doing back in Vistria, Draven's research, etc. I think as I get into the TDDC 2 campaign, I'm going to lean in more to this aspect of adaptation, to adding scenes and details to improve the story, character arcs, etc., while still being faithful to the overall feel of the campaign and the events and battles which did actually happen at the table. For example, Liz and Rainbow Dash were actually brought back from Polaron just kind of between sessions as a hand wave, because I felt kind of stupid for worrying about teleport limits instead of what was fun, and giving them my version of Gemjump still didn't retroactively fix that mistake. On that side note, 3.5 edition Gemjump is a variant teleportation spell which helped you teleport more accurately, and was largely pointless here since I wasn't rolling for teleport errors due to my bias against crazy game-derailing RNG. So when they found a scroll of Gemjump among the loot from the underground cathedral, I had shamelessly hijacked that name for a totally different spell. The Deathfin setting version of Gemjump is not itself a teleport. Instead, at the cost of a 100 gold piece gem, it allows you to convert an Eldritch Eye into an Eldritch Stone. In addition to being compact and much easier to transport, you can bring an Eldritch Stone along with you when teleporting without that stone losing its Eldritch power, the way Eldritch Eyes normally become useless if you try to teleport with them. In addition, when you use such an Eldritch Stone as a component for teleport, your capacity, the number of creatures you can bring along, is doubled, meaning they could bring everyone, including their oversized friend Rainbow Dash, without wasting 2 extra Eldritch Eyes for another round trip. So this higher level spell doesn't unrestrict teleportation exactly. You still need to farm Eldritch Eyes if you want to zip around the world that way, and that creates, at minimum, the mindset that teleporting has a cost. But this version of Gemjump removes a lot of the hassles that players had to put up with when they first gained access to the powerful spell. Setting up Liz as the new arms trainer at the Basilica was also something that happened later, more of a wrap-up, but it made more sense to weave it in here and gave her a little more chance for characterization. Similarly, I rearranged and tightened a bunch of random discussions from their return to Vistria, deciding what to do, where to build Draven's apparatus, how his family would be affected by the nation's internal conflicts, into this much more explicit return to Draven's estate scene. This helped me incorporate my non-sequitur skeleton staff joke from the table, a very important goal, but it also let me add in a scene which I had in my GM notes, but which apparently I never got around to actually playing out at the table, because Draven's brief visit to his home had taken place as more of a vague, disjointed discussion. I really liked the scene of the messenger sent by Lord Kinokoro to make the trade he had promised, and the hints at Nezumi culture as yet another corner of the world which exists on its own, independent of our main story. But it's a little sad that I never got around to playing it out at the table. Therefore, all the PC's responses to the Rat Man were written by me. I mean, after 10 years of making these videos, I think I have a pretty good grasp of the characters, in and out of character. But it feels a little bittersweet to have the scene play out basically as planned. I like writing straight fiction, and I like adapting our tabletop adventures, but this weird middle ground feels a little lacking in soul, in the unpredictable spark of playing it out with your friends. Unlike the above, the ghost hunting subplot is almost 100% stuff the players really said and did, give or take a little paraphrasing, and, crunching a scatterbrained, undirected 2 hours or so down to an easy-to-follow 10 minutes. Adapting it was a good way to make sense of an adventure, using the term loosely, which was far, far less planned and more improvised than most of my GMing. All I really had going in was, Ghost in the Mill had killed herself, but blamed the other ghost. Other ghost had left with the miller when she fled. Ghost in the Mill was actually chasing after him, even though she was the one who had killed him. That was virtually it. My main aim was to give an opportunity for role-playing and for the players to decide, to have that bit of a twist once they heard the second side of the tale, and I tried to keep the story fairly gray morally so that whichever ghost the players sided with, it was somewhat justifiable, Or, they might have chosen neither and tried to capture them both. In fact, it was suggested at one point that they capture both ghosts, which prompted the less serious idea to trap them both in the same jar and just watch them fight. Like BattleBots, only ghosts. Obviously, the version you see in the episode feels a little less gray, emphasizing certain facts more than others to justify their choice to turn against the woman, though, interestingly, it ended up with them recruiting the male ghost for Draven's research anyway. Though, frankly, I did feel the actual basic story of the two ghosts was biased a bit in this direction, so maybe it wasn't as gray as intended anyway. In terms of stuff which was cut for time and for flow, the players did try to establish how long ago this happened. When Angel asked the ghost what year it was, her response was only off by 1, suggesting that her death was far from ancient history. It seemed like she had committed suicide about a year ago, which was probably 1 to 2 years after she had fatally stabbed the mugger near the refugee camp. But whatever a ghost is, whatever remains of that person, their perceptions, or maybe their long-term memories, seem to be at least partially static, frozen at the moment of their demise. Maybe that's not all ghosts. I mean, does that apply to Don Mazur, the dwarven ghost they fought in Shadowfell? Hard to say. Regardless, because of the lost soul's fuzzy grasp of time, it was difficult to figure out what they had been doing in the meantime. But it seemed likely that the mugger had been hanging out in the mill, causing little, if any, trouble. Now, Hannah the miller and her father before her had been doing her discount bed and breakfast thing for some years, housing people, mostly Varandi refugees, who were traveling across the country in search of opportunity. One possibility is that the dead man's dream had been to travel south, and that's what he was stealing purses for funds with which to travel. Perhaps he'd heard about Hannah's mill as the first step in that journey, and that was as far as he could imagine back when he was alive. But recently, because of the treaty, because the Diluvian Empire had withdrawn from the nearest third of Varandi, the Vistrians and the Varandi nobles, the government in exile, were scrambling to organize a society there to repopulate the region. There was suddenly a great deal of risk and opportunity for those brave or desperate enough to go, so in the last couple weeks, the mill had been full almost every night with refugees and even poor native Vistrians flocking to the wild south frontier. So one theory is that somehow, driven by some instinct or some vestige of her intelligence and logic, the dead woman's spirit had followed the increased movement of ethnically Varandi people to the mill, where she finally found the ghost of the man she viewed as having ruined and ended her life. That might roughly fit the timeline, explaining why activity in the mill had gotten more noticeable and frightening to the miller until she was frightened out of her mill, and the ghostly refugee had clung to her to flee his eternal pursuer. Now, when the party found out the woman had killed herself because her community had turned on her, shunned her for the gratuitous killing of the thief, Little One did have another idea of how to resolve it.
If you want to put the girl in the windmill to rest, we could just convince the refugees that the guy she killed had attacked her. Say he became a ghost out of guilt. Costs us literally nothing.
That is what she sounds like she wants, I suppose. Wouldn't that be distorting the truth, though? Not sure that helps with this kind of thing. I would be hesitant to lie about it. Just as I am hesitant to believe that what she wants is, in fact, what she needs. As far as the ending of the ghost story is concerned, though, where they protected Zahir from those relatively harmless attacks until he could complete his soul-shepherding ritual, you know how I say I'm a better storyteller than a game master? This is an example, because that little bit at the end, just giving them each a chance to describe their resolution of this low-stakes encounter, that would have been great GMing. But I didn't think of that at the time. Did the ghost throw bedrolls down at them? Hell yes. Black actually tried to distract the ghost by faking that he was casting the spell Blistering Radiance, which, given she couldn't leave during the day, probably would have messed her up. Except, I couldn't really justify the bluff working because she was just a regular person. They can tell something looks like spellcasting, but she'd have no idea what spell he was faking or that it might be worse than the ethereal wind Zahir was creating. But did I explicitly tie the sleeping bag attacks to Zahir's ritual and prompt each player to describe their move? Nope. Not that clever, except in hindsight. The resolution at the table was basically, NPC gets out his candle, does the thing, I describe it. The version in the episode, as simple, as trivial as it seems, that would have been a lot more fun and given them more agency in the resolution of this minor story. So that, and their reactions, were me rewriting it into a much better encounter, even though it was such a small change from what really happened. Would have been even better if I'd come up with some little thing on the spot that the thief's ghost could have asked them to do in exchange for helping them out, instead of just, I'm so tired, I don't even care anymore. But man, did these scenes ever get a lot of mileage out of the fact that I somehow drew the ghost really good-looking hair, almost first try. Oh, and it may be hard to believe, but I definitely toned down the Taco Bell jokes. My supporters on Patreon get extras videos about a week early so that I can answer a bunch of their questions in the final version of this video using completely arbitrary voices. Especially when my version of the video was so short that it really needs the padding. Like this! Rinseku Blade asked, how often does the Hand of Sirius spread false stories or information to prevent panic? I feel that it would be a thing that would happen quite often. Like what happened at Good Place. I mean, one of their major functions is as a domestic intelligence organization. This was, perhaps, a window into what they really do. The Hand are part FBI, part MIB, though obviously unlike the Men in Black, they aren't trying to hide the existence of supernatural stuff. That would be silly in such a magical world. They just want to play down the extent of some of the Fey, Fel, and other mystical threats to Vistria, hide some of the more horrific aspects, because they don't want people to panic or to live their lives terrified of all the things that bump into night. The monarchs of Vistria through the ages appear to have made the choice to try to run a mundane human society, and thus try to suppress both the direct effects and the social influence of the forces that they view as supernatural and foreign, which likely includes the influence of many spirits who might be considered natural or even beneficial by other societies. Double Lucky asked, now that we are seeing the culmination of Draven's research and development, I do wish to ask how it was handled throughout the campaign. How much of it was his own set of directives and ideas on how to conduct research and development? Is there any advice you can give about doing something similar for a player who wants to research or create something far more complex than what most RPG rulebooks support? Well, get ready for disappointment. I did not have any interesting system for the research. I mean, what to do with the Astral Plague was a mess almost from the beginning, but especially since the party decided to teleport up to Vistria. Originally, I figured they would look into it further, and then I'd give them some quest, maybe from that non-asshole druid who told them about the hubris, and they get cured. But when they got the Rajas to enhance the White Seed and delay the onset by months, then teleported to a new hub full of plot hooks, it all got buried. Now, Draven was researching it, but it was no longer the, oh no, we're going to die, priority, so I figured we could just wrap that into the other quests they took on. Except how that actually worked out was more like adding one tiny, or often utterly trivial, bullet point to each major journey they set out on. And as you know from watching TDDC, each quest journey thing inevitably branches out into a bunch of twists or decisions, which inevitably makes that get a soil sample from each plane or whatever feel like an even smaller part of the overall task list. Now, if Draven's player suggested something, I would totally have tried to make it work, but my original instinct was to present him some a la carte options of what to focus his research on. For example, I gave him a choice of whether to focus on improving the sensitivity and power of his energy spectrum analyzer, or to instead focus on miniaturizing it into a portable field version, like a large tricorder. He chose the latter, But while I don't remember every step in the process, I'm pretty sure this taught him that I give you choices, you pick, is how I wanted to run research, and so that was the expectation from there on. So yeah, really wasn't all that interesting. The only part that seems fun about it was, in this episode, I asked him to describe the machine he was building to remove the plague, and everything, even some lines I gave to Midgard and some laboratory features I attributed to Higgins in the video, all came from him. Actually, it was supposed to look a lot more steampunk with more chemistry set components, more complex glassware and such, but art-wise I was focused more on making it look cool in my style and not spending forever on it than I was on totally reflecting his descriptions. Tom Johnson asked, Zoinks! The ghost in the mill, given what we know of her past, it feels like she might have had some sort of anxiety disorder, which was fueled by some racist views. Either anxiety or racism alone probably wouldn't lead to this tragedy, but together they make a perfect recipe for this disaster. Was that your intent, or am I reading too much into it? I didn't pin it down specifically to an anxiety disorder. I'm not sure it takes a diagnosable disorder for a person to become paranoid or otherwise irrationally dangerous in some respect, even if they are able to function pretty normally in other areas of life. And obviously, having an anxiety disorder doesn't make you dangerous. Just want to make that clear. Perhaps some terrible incident in her past had left her fearful and or made her feel so vulnerable and powerless that for years she fantasized about defending herself. Maybe in her mind she was not so much stabbing the mugger himself, but striking back at some metaphorical ghost from her own past. What happened at the D&D table was mostly improv, though, so the true backstory is left mainly to the imagination. Martin Svalas Sortelius asked, Are there any other ways to capture ghosts than the shepherd's ritual? There are certain magical relics, a whole variety of spirits, and likely numerous other ways, if somebody with magical skill were motivated enough to try to research it. But other than the shepherds, most people aren't worried about catching ghosts so much as banishing, destroying, or otherwise getting rid of them, which tends to be a little more straightforward. Arthur D. Gonzalez Merton asked, Wondering if the party considered killing the ghost. Would it have just regenerated? Would that be another way, a more violent way, to help it into the afterlife? Or would it destroy the ghost's soul, dooming it to nothingness? Angel did briefly suggest just killing it, right in the video. The ghost was ethereal, but not powerful, so with their spells and Angel and Mora's force crossbows, the party could easily have destroyed her. As for what it actually means for a ghost or lost spirit to be destroyed, one way to look at it is that ultimately those things are just a package of energy and sentience. When you destroy them, you are disordering that energy and sentience, shattering it into smaller pieces, so ultimately that energy will spread around the area and or the astral sea and or the physics planes, the ethereal plane and the plane of shadow. So a lot of different things could happen. It might gradually reform over time, probably into a weaker form, though it's possible if the spirit had an incredibly strong will, it might pull itself back together as some version of its former self. Or that energy sentience could get absorbed by other entities, whether incorporeal or living, fey or fell, or whatever, which leaves lots of room for whatever the story requires sorts of creatures, good, neutral, and monstrous, to exist. Dimon asked,
Little one doesn't care, but do you have an opinion on what was the weirdest thing the party has done?
I mean, if you skim the YouTube comments on the episode, a lot of people tried to answer that question. The weirdest thing they witnessed probably has to be the tall one taking a stone, a pebble, from Draven's hand, reaching up and placing it amongst the stars. Take that, physics. But weirdest thing they've done themselves is a tougher call. My gut instinct is probably something I've long since forgotten. 3C273 asked,
Little One, the character, didn't care about the ghost story, despite the player saying he was interested. But how did the player feel about coming back to Vistria, in particular the human Outtro politics? In the beginning, he seemed pretty hyped for a war with the Outtro.
My read is that he doesn't particularly want to mess things up for Vistria, and more relevantly, for his friends, the PCs from Vistria, but Little One is still pretty gung-ho to take the war to the Diluvians, given the slightest chance. And he's high enough level now that raising some kind of weird army and making a go of it feels more within reach, at which point I don't think he'd care too much about any potential blowback to the nations involved, in or out of character. 3C273 also asked,
You mentioned the hassle dealing with the teleports and Eldritch Eyes. Is the mechanic itself more annoying than it's worth? Or is it just a hassle in the sense that, at this point in the game, dealing with eyes and a large party and Rainbow Dash is not interesting enough to spend time at the table?
Now, I have no issues with the teleport limitations I put in. Players can get the spell Teleport as early as level 9, at which point traveling instantly across the entire world really ought to have some extra costs and even hassles. At the same time, by level 13 or later, when they might get this modified Gemjump spell, softening those limits also feels fine. And even then, I made it a rare spell you'd have to find or research so that I could still limit access if it didn't fit a particular campaign. My main issue here is specifically that sticking to the letter of the rules forced, or the prohibitive cost strongly encouraged, the party to leave some fun NPCs behind, and in hindsight, I really should have found a workaround or made an outright exception just in the interest of being more fun for everyone. Joshua Pike asked,
One thing bugging me for a while, could you set up like 20 of the return teleport circles and have them in reserve? Like, never carry eyes with you, then teleport using one of your return trip circles you set up, then setting it up again when you're done.
The return ritual, aka circles, and limitations thereof, weren't 100% refined to a rulebook standard, but the idea was that turn circle you set up was tied to that one teleport. If you teleport somewhere else, other than returning to your circle, it costs you a new Eldritch Eye, and your connection to the previous circle would be broken. The way the system is designed, teleporting in one direction is still always costing one Eldritch Eye. The circles just make it possible to go there and back at all, without having to hunt for a new Eldritch Eye at the destination. And in fact, if you teleport there and then you teleport somewhere else without using that return circle, you've actually wasted an extra eye. Xylem asked,
How do you solve the Underdark conservation of volume problem? Namely, if you mine out 1,000 cubic meters of stone, you now have to put 1,000 cubic meters of stone debris somewhere, which makes expanding your evil drow city challenging. You could magic it away, of course, but this doesn't seem an elegant solution. Alternatively, there could be so much empty space in the Underdark running out just isn't a problem yet.
The Underdark naturally has a lot of tunnels and caverns, so generally they'd be starting their city in a place that had space, and then as they expand they'd use that material for building, or else they'd have to dump it somewhere. Of course, the underground terrain also tends to shift over time, whether suddenly by seismic or pseudo-seismic activity, or via slower, weirder sorts of geologic shifting processes over the centuries. Large areas of stone tend to gradually gain tunnels, whereas large areas of space tend to suffer collapses or even to very slowly grow, fill in with stone if nobody's maintaining the area against such encroachment. Like, the Underdark wants to be varied and full of tunnels. Xylem also asked,
How dependent is Balvan on his human-like body? Is it just a puppet or an avatar of the real Balvan who is embodied in the mountain? If some powerful spellcaster were to destroy Balvan's body completely, how much would it hurt the spirit?
I'd say Balvan's body is the metaphorical heart of the mountain. If he was lured far enough away from the mountain not to be harmed, and you somehow nuked it flat, even if the roots of the mountain remained, Balvan's body would presumably drop dead and fade away, despite not being directly touched. Conversely, if you destroyed Balvan, the body, the mountain would physically still be there, but it would become dead, whatever that means. It would likely weather away faster, with peaks cracking and crumbling, though on a human's timescale you'd probably never notice the difference. It would be a much less magical, less spiritual place, though. At minimum, the garden, now maze, of three worlds would likely cease to function as a gateway between the planes. But hey, at least in his crippled and diminished astral form, he could finally be reunited with Zonda. Xylem also asked,
how immediate is a Vampire King's control for their shackles? Can they unbind them with a thought? Or do they have to perform some actions, like physically going to the shackle's location? Let's say a lieutenant decides to rebel for some reason. Will they have any span of time where they can use the shackle's power against their master?
This is one of those cases where the different time frames, from instant to has to physically visit the shackle, have potential for different, equally compelling narratives. And because of that, the most interesting answer is obviously, depends on the individual spirit shackle. Bessie asked, do the Vampire Kings have a method of telling what kind of result they could get from shackling a spirit without actually going through the process? Or do they have to go through all the trouble of shackling a spirit just to find out it grants the power to turn their skin blue every summer solstice? Seems like a hassle Swain would optimize out of his life. Nowadays, they all know clearly and often in great detail what most of the spirit shackles used by their enemies do. But when they do encounter a new, untapped spirit, in the early centuries it was all trial and error, but yes, I'm sure that by now they've found methods of determining in advance what the result of a particular spirit shackle would be, whether via a rare magic spell, some mystical relic, an allied fae or spirit, or a shackled one. Each of the Vampire Kings has their own methods for this and many other things. Bessie also asked, another question. Is Ioun and Vecna's battle for control over the source of all magic visible from areas of the astral sea? I've always imagined it was like seeing two galaxies collide in the night sky. Technically reachable, but very far away and extremely impressive in its magnitude. Is this impression accurate? Also, how do the three planes correlate with the astral sea? Are there areas of the astral more closely associated with one plane or another? Is it easier to access the astral from the Feywild and Shadowfell than the Feylands? The conflict between Ioun and Vecna may have looked that impressive, at least the initial clash, which may have lasted an unmeasurable amount of time, though nowadays what's going on between them is obscured from view somehow. The source, and their battle, is indeed very far away from most stuff in the astral sea. But as for the other planes, there's a region of the astral which surrounds the three worlds and interfaces with the physics planes, the ethereal and the plane of shadow. Within that close region of the astral sea, distance is kind of meaningless. That's tied to how teleportation works for us material creatures, by touching the astral and using it to bridge the distance between 2 points in our physical space. But there are other regions of the astral which are farther away from all this stuff relating to the material plane. I'm sure the contours of the astral sea are detailed and meaningful to many of the spirits there, but in mortal terms you can break it down to basically a coastal area around our three worlds. Then there's a great expanse between those worlds and the two self-contained regions we call the heavens and the hells. And then there's an even greater expanse between those two and the source of all magic, and probably a bunch of other weird stuff we mortals can't comprehend. Bessie also asked, seeing this episode's Anku ritual really reminded me of how little we know about the worship and rituals of the less noticeable gods in the setting. Can you tell us any more about the worship and practices relating to demigods like Raus and Anku, Or maybe the less involved gods like Amara, Asmodeus, Ioun, and Vecna. There aren't a lot of priests of demigods like Raus and Anku, but some rituals associated with them can spread pretty widely among the populace. Rituals so old, the people using them often don't have a clue where they originated or why they maintain these customs. Many species and societies have, over the ages, incorporated funerary and bereavement rituals from Anku's shepherds, intended to help the spirit of the deceased in their transition. These include basic physical details, like ensuring the body is buried facing up with eyes closed, and as intact as possible. People of some cultures who suffer an amputation in life have been known to save the lost limb in order that it be laid to rest with them. Or when cremating the dead, make sure to start the pyre with a sage leaf and a yew sprig, and always stand upwind. But there are also more spiritual concerns, one of the most common being that if the departed had a great goal or wish in life that you know of, you should lay them to rest with a prayer and with some token intended to resolve that desire. In simplest form, this often looks like bring a gold coin, or silver if you can't manage gold, with someone who dreamed their whole life of getting rich, or laying a trinket or dried flower from a faraway land with someone who wished to see the world. Small, lovingly carved statues are another common way to represent the spirit finding what they long sought. Aklis, also known as Araklis, Toxis, or Meft, is a demigod of poison and jealousy, one of several minor demigods who have arisen since Delvash used the death equation, almost as though the universe were attempting in some small way to balance out the uncontested domains which Delvash now possesses. Individuals who have been scorned in love or denied other things which they felt they deserved sometimes fall into the sway of Aklis, because jealousy is itself like a poison of the soul. Devotees of Aklis are known to microdose themselves with various toxins in an effort to develop immunity, but also in the belief that the side effects which twist one's own body, what most of us would consider sickness, in turn make the user's own poison use more effective against others, which is closely tied to the common practice of, ironically, slowly poisoning one's rivals with low doses. Some such practitioners have taken note of the teachings of Anku, and, if possible, they seek to have their dead rivals buried face down with eyes open, or to accidentally inhale cremation ashes from their victims. In addition to milking or eating poisonous spiders, those who worship Aklis have been known to covet the eyeballs of their dead, or in rare cases, living enemies, and to keep them as gruesome mementos, sometimes emulating a spider's crown of eyes. The most common worship of Raus is so simple as to be instinctual, to watch the sunrise or sunset with reverence for the beauty of the cosmos. Many also celebrate the solstices, or find at least one day a year to do nothing but sunbathe, absorbing the radiance. Some devotees of the demigod of the sun have forsworn the wearing of hats and consider the wrinkles of aged eyes, the residue of decades of squinting, to be a sign of wisdom directly tied to the number of days of sun those eyes have witnessed. To this day, many healers believe that bandages are best changed outdoors, in full sun, noon if possible, to make sure they are exposed to the direct light, in a practice traced back before Raus to the ancient sun god Pelor. Ioun is of course worshipped mainly by debating, by reading, and by sharing knowledge, though her adherents have been known to pass down bookmarks for generations, or even to seek out ancient and long-used 1,000-book marks, believing that Ioun's grace is accumulated in such strips of cloth or thin tassels from every page in which they have rested. It is said that the Eladrin have a library full of ancient tomes, where the keepers spend each day laboriously opening and closing the codices, moving their bookmarks in a centuries-long progression, taking care to leave each book fallow for 1 out of every 7 years. The worship of Vecna is, of course, a secret. As such, there are many different methods, usually convoluted, always hidden from one another, as those who would worship that most powerful of evil gods, he who will inherit all, as they say, search for others of their own faith in order to uncover and steal their methods. These crude and self-taught methods of worship sometimes lead them to form small, tight-knit secret societies where initiation to the deeper levels requires the unraveling of increasingly obscure and complex riddles and mysteries. One wonders if their methods might converge upon a true form of Vecna worship, which only the cleverest, most prying, and most clandestine uncover for themselves. I'm still trying to grind my way through the one fancy animation I wanted for episode 65, but while I keep making slow, incremental progress on that, I did manage to find the energy to record the third episode of Hammer and Smoke, which is a D&D 5e podcast in a style similar to TDDC, except audio only. I will eventually release that series to YouTube and podcast apps, once I get enough episodes together to drop a whole season of them. Try out that whole release schedule thing I keep hearing about. But until then, my Patreon subscribers get these adventures as soon as each episode is finished, and without all this like and subscribe, support me on Patreon shit. So they can follow all the totally normal stuff going on in that world. By the way, as we approach the 10th anniversary of Tales from My D&D campaign in December, Orestria made a video with my patrons' nominations for a bunch of their favorite scenes, NPCs, etc. So check out her video and vote your favorites in the polls linked in that video's description. But I can't thank you all enough for your extensive, though not infinite, patience as I try to finish out this TDDC arc with a bang, with an extra thankful thanks to Aether Mordu, Alberio, Oust, Aurelius, Bedimir, Bessie, Critical Hit 20, Carnlin, Darkwood, Dimon, Earl of Sanguine, Eckardir Thalion, Fireborn, Fey Crossroads, Fright Knight, General Mo, Gorefiend, Nine, Hakoon, John, Gator Island, Lieutenant Red, Lonito, Lord Aben, Malison Desh, MG3D, Norgren, OI1, Olden Man, Overlord Thor, Pedrig of Rooney, Pontus, Prismcat, Ramar Ulfist, Repbox, Stan the Man, Skyder97, Starfall, Cygax, Tambu and June, Toshiro7, Valis, Volkfang, WA Soul, Warsaw, Woodley, Quackers, Zombie, and Mars Project. The members of the organization.